Okay, so the best way to do this is just to kind of understand, again, the Le Chatelier principle that I mentioned in the previous video, which is just a system will act to counteract any stressor on that system. So let's just quickly go back up here. What did we do this? Oh yeah, right here. We were talking about mitral stenosis and enlarging of the left atrium. Well, if it's harder to get things through the mitral valve, whatever comes before it is going to do what it can to counteract that stress, to counteract it's hard to get things through. So it's just going to push a whole bunch. Kind of like if, you haven't studied enough for a test, what do? Well, you got to study harder. Maybe that's not a great example, but whatever. So stroke volume, well, it's how much you pump out. Stroke volume is affected by contractility. That makes sense. If you can't pump, then stroke volume is going to be pretty bad. Afterload and preload. So preload, let's start with that. Preload just means whatever is in the left ventricle before it gets pumped out. You can think of the load as whatever gets shot out, and the preload as, whatever is there filling up the left ventricle. And of course, problems with contractility will make it so that way the preload, not all of it is sent out. So if you have a heart that fills very nicely, you get the left ventricle nice and filled with blood, but it's not contractile, then only a little bit of that blood's going to get pumped out. So the preload is going to be high, and a lot of it will be left afterwards. So here's the afterload. And you can read into afterload however you want. I like to think of it as the work the left ventricle has to go against. Let's kind of look down here. So here's your left ventricle. If you have, stenosis or something, or you've got, whatever. Here you can see how you would have an increased afterload. It has to go against a lot of resistance here. Whereas if you have free-flowing, nothing but space, well, decreased afterload. There's not a lot of work that the left ventricle has to go against. Okay. What affects contractility? And therefore stroke volume. Okay. Well, catecholamines, of course. Increased calcium storage in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, huge. And all this stuff plays into it, okay? And then things like digitalis. And I particularly like digitalis, digoxin, whatever, because it's such a fun little mechanism that's very easy to test, that everyone just kind of forgets. So let's look at this thing right here. All right. So what's going on? Well, you have sodium-potassium pumps. Okay. And we can kind of read this thing through. Digoxin is stopping the sodium-potassium pump. As a result, you have less sodium exchanged for potassium, so you have a higher sodium concentration inside. Well, because of this higher sodium concentration inside, right here, well, you're not going to be able to have this sodium flow through here with a gradient and exchange, or get exchanged, for calcium. Makes kind of sense. Sodium doesn't flow out. There's a whole bunch of sodium right here, so this sodium's not going to flow in. This calcium won't flow out. Intracellular calcium, good for pumping. It's physiology 101. And here you can hear about hypokalemia and stuff, and digitalis, and digoxin toxicity. Pretty cool. Alright, preload. Vasodilators. Does that make sense? Certainly should. So, tell me right now, why do vasodilators decrease preload? Well, the reason is, when you got your handy-dandy heart, I guess I can draw it here. When you have your when you have everything going into the right atrium, if you have all your blood pooled in the venous system, then none of it's going to go back to your right atrium. However, if you don't have vasodilators, or if you don't have, venodilators, or whatever, the idea is that pooling of blood decreases, then you have all the blood that's not being stored in the systemic that's not being stored, outside of the heart, but it's going nice and it's going back into the heart. Afterload, mean arterial pressure, which makes sense. It's kind of the work the left ventricle has to go against. And myocardial oxygen demand. We're going to go through really quickly. I have to pull up a page about wall tension, wall stress, Laplace's law, how it relates to Pascal and all that stuff. So let me pause this for a second. So here's our really cool Laplace law and Pascal law. So what was going on here? Okay. So let's quickly go through Laplace's law and kind of the Pascal law, Pascal principle, or whatever, but not the wager. Let's go through Laplace's law and see how that kind of makes sense with myocardial oxygen demand and things like wall stress, wall tension. Because these are important points, not necessarily for step one, which you might be wondering, well then who cares, go on to the next thing. But it is important in terms of understanding what can cause different things. And it's not just in the heart. You can see this, or the effects of this when you do GI. You can see it when you're doing pulmonology. You can see it everywhere. Okay, so let's just quickly go through that. All right. So you have Pascal's law. Okay, Pascal's principle. Pascal's law. When there's a pressure applied in a confined space, it's going to distribute evenly. So you can look at this little balloon right here, okay, this clown balloon. You have a confined space, everything's tied off, right? You assume no air is going in and out, it's just confined. Well, the pressure here is going to be the same as the pressure here. But I can tell you, and you can tell me, that if you're going to pop it, you're going to pop it right here. Why are you going to do that? What does that have to do? It has to do with the wall tension. Wall tension has to do with the pressure times the radius. Here you have Mr. LaPlace. And he tells you how wall tension is equal to pressure times radius. So the pressure is the same throughout, but the radius isn't. And as a result, this is going to have more tension. Tension, you can kind of think of it kind of like an elastic band, right? The more tense it is, the more you stretch it out, the more it's willing to break. Kind of like if you're in a tense situation, or you're with a bunch of people and you're all going to fight. It's because it's very tense. It's about to snap. So, with that in mind, wall tension, pressure times radius. Well, the pressure is going to be evenly distributed throughout, remember, but the radius isn't. How do you combat an increase in wall tension? So what does the heart do? What does the left ventricle do when you have an increase in tension and it doesn't just explode? It thickens. It thickens. And you can kind of think of wall stress as the per unit area, or the per unit volume, or whatever, for the tension. So remember, we're tying in afterload, increase pressure, increase afterload. Increase wall tension, tying in the afterload, tying in the Laplace law, tying in wall tension, wall stress, and then reconstruction of the heart due to increased pressure. Alright, so now you know why you have concentric hypertrophy. To decrease wall stress. Why? Because you have an increase in wall tension. Why? Because you have an increase in pressure. you have an increase, theoretically, or definitely, in the size of the ventricle. And it's going to be under very high tension. It's going to snap. To prevent it from snapping, you have to increase the volume. You have to give it, a thicker thing. Let me kind of say or show you what I mean by a thicker thing. Right here, we can all agree that this is under higher tension, right? However, and it's because it's stretched very thin. However, the thickness here, it's not as thick, or it's much thicker than, the per unit right here. But imagine if this section right here had the thickness of this part of the balloon. Well, then you wouldn't be as worried. And that's why you have concentric hypertrophy. Because you don't want the heart to explode. And so you end up having a thicker ventricle, a thicker wall. Alright, so that was kind of roundabout, but hopefully you got it.